Manhattan's Lower East Side, a vibrant mix of nightlife, art galleries, and trendy bars. It's the kind of neighborhood where high-end condos brush up against historic buildings. Tompkins Square Park, a longtime gathering place, bustles with skateboarders, tourists, and locals, all set against the backdrop of ever-rising real estate prices. But beneath the surface of today's Lower East Side, there's a lesser-known history. A history of resistance, community, and radical self-sufficiency. Right here, where pricey lofts now stand, an unconventional way of life once thrived in the not-so-distant past.
We took this building illegally. Yeah, lived in it illegally for many, many years. And
it was rubble, like, everywhere. You'd be hauling rubble for days. And there'd always be more rubble to haul, you know. There was crumbling plaster, the ceilings would fall in.
All the wood on the inside, everything was all dried out. And they burned easy. Some of them hadn't been repaired since like the 20s or 30s.
Sometimes people, strictly, I'm sleeping on the subway, I don't have any place to go, I can't afford any place. Maybe I have a little criminal record or something or other. For whatever reason, I need to squat. I'm freezing on the street. So you have that. And the other side is, I could probably afford a place, but I'm sick of these rip-off rents. I don't want to spend, 75% like most people are doing nowadays of my income for these rip-off rents, which is like theft, it's fraud. So I want to squat because I want to participate in a movement that does ideological battle with the notion that you should be charged for your, the right to have a roof over your head.
There was a huge housing shortage in New York. There still is. And, there were a lot of people living on the streets. There were a lot of people living in the park.
I would define the squatter as someone who occupies building or land without official permission, without property rights, without legal property rights. So there were people taking over buildings at that time who were anarchists who were opposed to private property and trying to create a way to live outside of that system. There were people who were homesteaders who really wanted to find a pathway into sort of city-approved programs for people to renovate and then become owners of vacant buildings.
Been down here since 1977. Lost my apartment the first working day of January 1984. Was homeless for about a month and a half. Couch surfed for a little bit, slept in the park for a couple of weeks before I got into my first squat. This building here was my original squat. Squatted right up there. This was the oldest squat in the neighborhood, in our scene.
In the 1970s, New York City faced a financial crisis. While Wall Street investors thrived, the Lower East Side buildings sat abandoned and entire blocks were left to crumble. With these empty spaces came opportunity. People struggling to secure shelter occupied neglected buildings, breathing new life into the space and building a community. What began as a practical solution to an immediate housing problem opened the door to a radical political movement, squatting.
I would say that one of the things that made C-Squat special is that it really was an occupation that came out of a scene.
In the 1980s, a group of squatters took over 155 Avenue C, turning it into C-Squat. They repaired collapsed staircases and leaking roofs, transforming the neglected space into a home. Graffiti art covered the walls, punk shows took over the basement, and nearby lots became gardens for mutual aid and community events.
And a scene that had a really long, deep tradition of mutual aid and care. And so a lot of the people who were attracted to C-Squat were people who had lost ties with their families of origin, maybe, or were sort of seeking a new home base in the world. And because of that culture in DIY punk of mutual aid and because of The fact that it was a lot of young people coming together away from their families of origin, it really became in a lot of ways a family-style building.
Okay, we had just about everything we needed right down here. We even had our own blacksmiths. Just basic anarchy.
These buildings and these groups of buildings created this community of mutual aid, of sharing, of pooling resources, of being very creative in both how we defended our homes and how we built our homes.
Throughout the 90s, as the city's economy recovered, tension grew between squatters and city officials.
We organized an eviction watch network. So by 1988, 89, we started down here in earnest really in 85. So by 1990, let's say, there were a good 30 buildings that were going.
There were dozens of buildings at one point, and we had the whole phone trees to activate if there was some kind of action against one of the buildings, if one of the buildings was threatened, if there was an eviction going down, if there was a fire, if there was something happening where they needed support. We could activate this whole group of people from the other buildings and fellow squatters to media, people in the media who were sympathetic towards us, people in the community who were sympathetic towards us, who would all come out and put bodies on the street as witnesses and as supporters when stuff was happening. So it sort of became this very creative alliance of people with different skills.
On the Lower East Side were almost unique in New York City in that they were willing to physically defend their buildings against the police, often multiple times.
Amid the chaos of evictions and displacement, squatters turned to a new option: legalization. Rather than continue the endless cycle of raids and resistance, the city and some squatter groups began negotiating a path to formalize their occupation.
It was an interesting transition when the squats became legal.
People thought it would take a year or two, and it took much, much longer. Most buildings took over 10 years to complete the process. And as part of that, some people left. Some people were like, I'm an anarchist who does not want to be a property owner, and I don't want to be part of this. Some people stuck around but refused to participate, either refused to fix up their apartments or refused to pay their monthly due.
After years of negotiations, 11 squats, including C Squat, were legalized and given low-income, limited equity co-op status.
They were places for people who couldn't really function in normal society, and gave those people places to exist and to live. When we went legal, we now had financial responsibilities. And some buildings lost people because those people either wouldn't or couldn't function in those ways. They weren't able to hold a job. They weren't able to be responsible in the ways that we're now required to be responsible. So that was, I think, a loss of the freedom to make space for most anybody.
Young people drawn to punk music, anarchism, or simply in need of a place flocked to the scene. C Squat became a gathering place for this emerging community, hosting punk shows and workshops that brought people together.
No, we didn't take over the neighborhood. So we didn't win there, and that was really one of my big plans and dreams and what have you.
We had a lot of victories, and we had a lot of success in proving that we could build these homes using sweat equity and recycled materials and our own, smarts. And that's how we defeated a lot of the attacks against us too. We outsmarted them a lot.
And that's when we made the deal with the city, and that's what stopped it. And that kind of put an end to our whole thing. Like I say, it's not that some people would say we sold out, but like I say, we're still here.
In 2012, the Museum of Reclaimed Urban Space was founded in an empty storefront at C Squat by a grassroots environmental group. The museum displays the history of Lower East Side activism while empowering visitors to advocate for sustainable change through workshops on gardening, composting, art, and biking. The gardens that had been taken over by squatters were maintained as self-sustaining community spaces, offering a venue for events and providing green spaces in the heart of the city.
Yeah, the gardens were really treasures in the neighborhood. The neighborhood, it's so nice now. It's got trees and flowering trees and all the gardens are lush, but it was very gray. It was very depressed. It was grimy. There was very little color. And these marvelous women, the Dominican women and the Puerto Rican women of the neighborhood primarily, started clearing these lots and planting on them. And, they wanted a space for the kids to play. And
in a lot of cases, squats were places where women were able to learn building trades and learn how to do heavy construction work or plumbing or electricity or framing or plastering or brickwork. Squats were really places where women could do that, learn how to do that kind of construction and be treated as equals, and many women found that to be a really important, empowering, even life-changing part of the experience of being squatters.
And then they'd build like casitas, these little houses on the lots, so that, people were living in tiny, crowded apartments, and this was a little space outside. They could play cards, they'd have ducks or rabbits or, hens, and, on these lots, and it started to green the neighborhood, and of course we loved that.
Some of the most important places in New York City neighborhoods, and we've really had to fight for them. There have been many times over the years when the city has tried to sell that land for housing, and there's other places to build housing. There's not other places to make gardens like this, and some of these gardens now have been here for 50 years or longer. People talk about the Lower East Side as being like fully gentrified, and it's super gentrified, but it's still actually a really mixed income and mixed race neighborhood, and that's in large part because of the work that squatters and homesteaders and especially Puerto Rican activists did to make sure that people who had lived there for a long time would have protected, affordable housing in which to live.
The story of those who once found refuge in abandoned buildings, left neglected by their legal owners, live on as a powerful memory within the fabric of the Lower East Side.
We've created a lot of change, a lot of ways.
I can't imagine how I could have survived in the city without affordable housing like this. And the fact that this was probably the last place in New York where anything like that could possibly happen.
We built a community and tried to create a culture. And we got homes, and that's what it was always about.
I think it's really important to notice these ways in which people are able to stay in the neighborhoods that they have lived in for a long time and still feel at home there.
In its history, as far as being able to create something out of nothing, about finding a potential in something that was there that could be turned into such a powerful and long-lasting achievement.